It's the month of May, but it may as well be December, because for motorsport fans, it's like Christmas. The slow, gradual build-up over the month that leads to the greatest spectacle in racing. The Indianapolis 500, or Indy 500 for the more sophisticated folk. It's one of few events in the year where the hype is up in the motor racing world, and whoever wins it will achieve undisputed legendary status. You become a sort of, well, not a motor racing god, but like a kind of prince. Except a good one, not this guy. But I'm sure a lot of you, especially those who might be new to INDYCAR, are wondering why this is such a big deal. A 500-mile race around a track that goes left, before, you never guess, going left again. Well, sit back and relax, because unlike a lot of other YouTubers, my script was not made by ChatGPT. It was made by a troglodyte with an unhealthy obsession over racing, and I'll walk you through why the Indy 500 is the greatest spectacle in racing. But before we dive into that, just a little bit quickly, I want to talk about this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Surfshark the name, VPN the game. It's a service that protects your information by encrypting all the data that you send through the net, protecting said data, thereby keeping any of the more delightful members of society from getting at it. But of course, this ain't a one-trick pony. I mean, this thing ain't riding off the success of Drive to Survive and a thick accent. For you see, as we all know, content from streaming services can be restricted based on whatever country you happen to be in. For some reason, it's the cold hard reality we live in. I don't know. However, with Surfshark, you can bypass that by simply changing your location. Not only is this good for people who want to keep up with their favorite content, but it can also be a vital tool for those who live in countries that heavily censor their people for whatever their reasons may be. It ain't quite teleportation, but it is about as close as we're gonna get right now. So, here's some incentive. Use my link in the description and use the promo code JoshRebel for an exclusive offer and 3 extra months for free. Which means for around about a couple of bucks a month, you are fully protected. Plus, you have those 3 free months and a 30-day money-back guarantee as well. So what the bloody hell are you waiting for? Mega thanks again to Surfshark for their continued support. Okay, let's get back to the show. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway is one chunk racetrack, but how this thing morphed into what it is today isn't quite as straightforward as you might think. Back in the early 1900s, the love for racing cars was just as strong as it is today, even if it was somewhat remedial. But while races were typically held on the streets of wherever it was that the cars happened to end up, someone eventually thought, what if we had like a sort of track for these cars? That way we don't run over people anymore. An Indiana businessman by the name of Carl G. Fisher liked said idea, and when he paid visit to the newly built Brooklands track in the UK, he decided that the United States of America, with its abundance of domestic manufacturers, should become the epicenter of motor racing. After all, he reasoned, what could be more logical than building the world's greatest racetrack right here in Indiana? After finding some farmland 5 miles outside of Indianapolis and some backers to help fund his venture, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was opened in 1909. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, for you see, there was a very dark cloud hanging over this racetrack, because in the early stages of its life, it had become a bit of a widowmaker, with a gravel and tar surface that broke apart if you made the mistake of looking at it. So, with people refusing to race on the track as it was, Fisher knew that change was required. The surface needed to be safer, and it was decided that the new surface would be bricks. 3.2 million bricks were used to create this Goliath, thus why the Speedway donned a nickname that still persists to this day. They still call this place the Brickyard. Heading into 1910, however, crowd numbers were dwindling. A change in marketing approach was needed, and less events were needed to be run, lest they run out of green paper. On Memorial Day, a single 500-mile race was established and served as the flagship event for the venue. Thus, this is how the Indianapolis 500 was born. Over the years, the track gradually changed in the interest of safety, with only a line of bricks remaining that serves as the start-finish line, but the race itself as a whole remained the same. Through the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, up to the 1940s, it became an established event on the American auto racing calendar, and then it all came to a grinding halt. With the world at war, every bit of resource had to be diverted. Then again, at that time, racing was kind of the last thing on people's minds. However, 3 years later, when the world was finally about ready to calm down again, the Brickyard had fallen into disrepair. 3-time winner of the 500, Wilbur Shaw, fought like hell to fend off property developers to keep the Speedway alive. He found an investor in Tony Horman, who bought the track, and with necessary repairs made, the Indy 500 returned in 1946, and just a few years later would be added to the inaugural Formula One World Championship calendar. Although this was a kind of a weird one. It wasn't run to Formula One regulations. The regular drivers hardly ever raced there, and was often run on the same weekends as one of the European races, which meant it was more of a novelty event, a sort of quid pro quo in a sense. Maybe. However, once the race was thrown off the F1 schedule in 1960, that's when the Europeans decided to come over to play. Jim Clark and Graham Hill would win in 1965 and 1966 respectively, with McLaren and Lotus providing race-winning cars, and Lotus even turning up with a jet-powered car back in 1968. As the 70s bled into the 80s, the American open-wheel scene began to see more expats join the grid, and all were strong at the 500, to a point where, today, the majority of that grid ain't American. Some are former Formula One drivers, some are former prospects from the junior circuit who almost made it to Formula One. Why are they here then? What is the allure of this race? Well, really, history. To win here is to etch your name into the history books. You put yourself amongst motor racing immortality. Sure, back in the day, it was a bigger challenge, partially because the cars handled like boats, but reliability was a major factor. In them times, telemetry was restricted to a clipboard and a 25-cent pocket watch. Today's Indy 500 is a tad different. Run as part of the INDYCAR series, the teams and cars boast technology worlds ahead of years gone by. They may be 2.2-litre twin-turbo V6s, but heading into Turn 1, they will be reaching over 240 miles an hour. Average speeds over the lap exceed 230 miles an hour, unless your name is Rahal Letterman Lanigan. Sure, there are the powerhouse teams in the field, such as Team Penske and Chip Ganassi, but the margins are tight. Being just a millisecond off the pace could mean the difference between qualifying and not qualifying. There are only 33 slots on that grid, and typically more than 33 drivers attempt to qualify for the race every year. To prepare an entry into the 500 does cost around $1 million, but that doesn't stop people attempting a one-off event and praying that they actually qualify. Qualifying itself takes place 1 week before the race and is run over 2 days. With each qualifying run, you're given 4 flying laps, and where you rank is based on the average speed you achieve over those 4 laps. On Saturday, you're given at least 1 attempt to qualify. If you qualify 12th or higher, you advance into the Fast 12 shootout on Sunday, giving you a chance to better your position. If you qualify between 13th and 30th, your position is locked in, and we'll see you next week. If you qualify 31st or lower, you're kind of If you're down there, you gotta come back on Sunday. And if you're 34th or lower in what is called last chance qualifying, you'll be taking an early bus home. Should you qualify, however, you'll be competing in the greatest spectacle in racing. Sure, there might be a million practice sessions throughout the month of May to help you prepare, but this is it. You salute the stars and stripes before getting into the car, where you'll hear the most famous words in racing: drivers, start your engines. The clock ticks over and you head off onto the 3 parade laps, the first of which is used to wave at the crowd, the second of which is used to warm your car and tires up, and the third is when you silently yourself as the green flag draws nigh. When you start that 500-mile, 200-lap race, you'll be starting in 3 wide formation, which, no matter how many times you watch it, still looks sketchy as hell, but it is completely safe, provided you don't develop the jitters like Kevin Kogan did back in '82. The green flag drops and you're off on a big-ass adventure. During the opening laps, you're settling into the groove, but you are also analyzing cars around you. What are they doing? How are they doing? Should I hang back or get ahead of them in queue? Races like this are one big game of chess. It's all about making the right move at the right time. It's also why it's important that, aside from your opponent's cars, you've got to keep an eye on your own. A loose race car may be fast, but if you let it get away from you on this track, the consequences are dire. Sure, it might be a rectangle racetrack that doesn't really command the slightest sense of direction to navigate, but all 4 of those corners are different in their own ways, and all of them can catch out the best of drivers. That, coupled with the rate of speed and the proximity of the barriers, mistakes are not something you can make and get away with. Therefore, the use of the weight jacker to shift the weight of the car from side to side is but one of the things you can utilize to help you avoid an early appointment with Mr. Concrete. Every few laps, variables around you will change. Therefore, you are in a constant state of monitoring where the car is at and where you are at. Throughout that day, there will be cautions, bringing the pace car out, giving you and your strategist a migraine. Under these conditions, you are tempted to come down pit road, but even without it, you'd have to venture down here anyway for a fresh jug of fuel and a hot batch of new tires from the oven. This will occur multiple times throughout the race, and as series legend Scott Dixon found out a couple of years ago, if anyone, be it you or the crew members, make a mistake, it will completely destroy your race. Any penalty in this race is devastating. As the laps die down and you start getting into the last 50 laps or so, that's when the decisions become more crucial. Do you keep your cool, or do you roll a dice? Keep your composure, or do something like make a complete gamble on fuel. Sometimes this doesn't pay off, such as with Robbie Gordon back in 1999, running out of fuel one lap from the end. Or it can go the other way. Alexander Rossi in 2016, one less pit stop than the rest, but by the start of the last lap, he had over 20 seconds worth of gap to the driver behind, who was Carlos Munoz. They saved like crazy, but even then, when he exited turn 3, Rossi had run out of fuel. He pulled in the clutch, let the momentum carry him toward the finishing line, and Munoz, who was flat out the whole way, could not catch him. Running virtually half a lap with no fuel is one hell of a way to win it, but it ain't the only way. In 2011, J.R. Hildebrand had it made. In his debut run at the 500 and first full season in INDYCAR, he was about to make the biggest impression he possibly could. He had 4 turns left, 3 turns left, 2 turns before becoming an Indy 500 champion. And then he came across Charlie Kimball, who was a lap down and going much slower. Hildebrand tried to go around the outside. Big mistake. Despite having momentum, he lost it. Dan Weldon would sweep on by to take a famous victory, and Hildebrand went from hero to zero within the space of a corner. Regardless of how you win this event though, the fact of the matter is, you've won it. Unless we start talking about 2002, a race that requires every bit of skill from a driver, one that has seen legends from all across the globe falter in its midst, tests the endurance of a driver, both mental and physical, and provides the greatest of entertainment. It also serves as part of the Triple Crown of motorsport, with the other 2 events being the Monaco Grand Prix and the 24-hour of Le Mans. Only one driver has ever achieved that feat, that being Graham Hill. The winner gets their face sculpted on the Borg-Warner trophy and given milk in Victory Lane, which, despite these tough times we live in, they opt to pour over themselves rather than fully drink. So waste a good dairy. And there you have it. A tough, grueling race that punishes literally any mistake, where driving prowess, whilst good, also has to be combined with brains and bravery, screaming along at 240 miles an hour, whilst also calculating exactly how to beat all those around you. That's why you can't miss it. That's why the Indy 500 matters.